On today's show, Jalen Green's Houston Rockets season in review, expectations coming into the season, his overall growth, and questions that we still have, as well as one game, one play, and one number that stand out from this past campaign. It's all coming up on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, where the best way you can help the show out is to comment your thoughts below in the YouTube comments. Give us your thoughts on Jalen Green's overall season. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Look, I admit it, I have a bit of a competitive side, and my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play Store. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for being an everydayer and making the show part of your day every single day. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, the Podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Here to break down Jalen Green's 23-24 basketball season. And Ben, this was a season that honestly, it's going to be kind of interesting as we break this one down, because if we're being completely honest from the jump, about 2/3 of the season was a little rough around the edges for Jalen Green. A lot of bumps in the road as he was, adapting to Ime Udoka's system, adapting to winning, trying to be a winning basketball player for the first time in his career. And I think when we look back, hindsight being 2020, we can safely say that there was a lot of positives to come from this season, but it wasn't without its, trials and tribulations along the way.
I think going in, a lot of us, and certainly myself, looked at things very idealistically, in that it's year 3, the season preceding a summer in which he's eligible for a contract extension. And so it would have been perfect for this to be the full-fledged Jalen Green breakout, because in a perfect world, that's how it works out, is that by the end of a third season, you know what the future trajectory is going to be. And so you're able to bid with confidence. Now, you don't have to bid. You can take it to restricted free agency, as Rafael Stone has pointed out lately. But in an ideal sense, yeah, you would have a good idea by the end of year 3. And I don't think we quite do just yet. There is some inconsistency that still needs to be ironed out. But I think going into the year, a lot of the expectations were a little too high, because even with a new coach in Ime Udoka, who clearly knows what he's doing, just the shock to the system of Jalen Green going from not only 2 years of Stephen Silas ball, but going through 2 years as the focal point of Stephen Silas ball, and then transitioning to a system in which there was a lead guard in Fred VanVleet who was capable of running the show. There was, for most of this season, an all-star level player, an Alperen Sengun, who could be your undisputed number 1 option. Both of those things were factors that Jalen did not have to deal with his first couple of years with Stephen Silas, where things were catered to him. Now, he was not the only player transitioning from Silas to Udoka, but for the most part, the other guys who were transitioning for complementary pieces on offense, like Jabari and Tari, it's pretty easy for them because they're playing off the ball anyway, and so they're probably getting even better shots. In terms of Alperen Sengun, it wasn't like he was leaned on nearly as heavily as Jalen was his first couple of years, so there weren't as many bad habits to shake. So I think with Jalen in particular, the stark contrast between the Silas years and Udoka, that transition was a little tougher than I think we all factored in going into this season. I think that's why it took longer for him. And I think that is something to sort of keep in mind as we grade his season, is that while definitely the second half of the season was a lot better than the first half, there's reasons for that, especially because the one weakness that's always been there for Jalen Green, beyond just the X's and O's things like his jump shot, how many free throws he can draw, how he finishes inside, there's always been this question of how does he handle adversity? Because from the start of his NBA career, when the vibes are good, when the ball is going through the bucket, he can look like an all-star. What I think Jalen needs to improve on, and this is pretty common of young players around the league, is finding ways to impact the game when his shot isn't going in, turn it around on the fly if it's not his night, as opposed to having slumped shoulders, bad body language, and accepting that this just isn't his game or isn't the Rockets' game. And I think trying to fix that problem while also playing with better teammates in Fred and Sengun offensively, and with a coach who is trying to win and is going to hold you accountable if you aren't doing that. In other words, if Jalen doesn't have it going and All P does, you better get the ball to All P. And so that tendency makes it even more likely, in my opinion, for Jalen to sort of fade back and say, this isn't my night. My time is going to come somewhere else. And I think that's something that throughout this season, Jalen had to sort of feel his way out of. And so for all those reasons, I think it took Jalen a little bit longer to get going than we would have liked to have seen when we approached this in October.
It's funny you mentioned the fading out, right? It gives me kind of flashbacks to, him in his rookie year playing alongside Christian Wood, or even last year playing alongside Kevin Porter Jr., right? There was that tendency to kind of just, okay, somebody else has it going, I'm just going to fade into the background. Whereas now I think we have seen, and we'll get into this a little bit more here in just a moment as we talk about some of the areas of growth in his game, his ability to impact the game in a variety of ways besides just having the ball in his hands and scoring the ball. Now he can do it in a variety of ways. I do think coming in the expectations, right, where kind of you have this preconceived idea of, the year 3 leap, right? Or what, who an NBA player is. Yeah. And I don't know why we all settled on year 3. I think it makes a lot of sense for some of the reasons you pointed out, right? The contract extension eligibility at the end of the year. You are kind of, by year 3, you've been in the NBA 3 or 2 seasons. The third year is kind of that year where you expect a little bit of a takeoff, I guess. I will say, to piggyback on your point earlier about the 2 years of Silas ball, right? It took me a little while to realize this, and I regret that I didn't realize it sooner. Is just that, right, it wasn't just the Silas ball. It was, Jalen Green was brought up in the AAU era of basketball, right? And so he had to break out of some of those bad AAU tendencies. He also got 1 year in the G League, the now defunct G League, Ignite, that's no longer a thing. So he went through a lot of these processes where, how different of a player would Jalen Green look like if he had gone to college and gotten like a more structured system and a better, winning environment there, rather than the, I get that the G League was supposed to be, preparing these players to be professionals in the NBA and whatnot, but I think we can look back now and say that the structure really wasn't all that great with the G League Ignite, right? They were kind of going out there and just kind of doing a little bit of whatever. It wasn't as structured as you probably would have gotten if you had gone through a collegiate program and maybe prepared them a little bit better for the NBA landscape. But so you pile all that together, and I think the expectations were maybe a little bit unreasonable coming into year 3 for Jalen.
Well, and the big difference between the G League Ignite and a top college program is that with the G League Ignite, it's all about the player's development, as opposed to at a top college program. One of the big benefits is that you are trying to win at a high level. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what the transition was. And you're right. It's not just the 2 years with Steven Silas and Kevin Porter Jr. It goes back to the G League Ignite as well. The last few years have all been about Jalen Green specifically and his personal development. This year, as soon as the ball tipped off at the end of October, it was not about just that. It was about trying to win. And all of a sudden, you're putting him not only with a new coach that has high expectations, but also with proven commodities in Fred VanVleet as your point guard and Alperen Sengun making a very early leap into an all-star caliber player. Then all of a sudden there's a big shock to the system. That's what I keep going back to. And so I think for Jalen, a guy who was a little predisposed, and this is common with a lot of young players, to sort of fading into the background if it's not his night, not only the higher expectations, but now knowing that the expectation is to win games and having guys that, at least at the start of the year, were more equipped than he was to do that. It was a lot for him to handle. It was a lot for him to process. And so I think going from 3+ years of it being strictly about his personal development to all of a sudden it being about winning and there being all these other priorities, it was a lot for him to handle. And so when you look back, it's not that shocking that the first half of the year was easily his worst half when you break down 2023 to 2024.
And then when you also kind of take a look at that and how all those factors came to play, that, Rockets fans themselves started to get a little fed up with his play because of some of the other factors, right? Because, Alperen Sengun and some of the other young guys, adjusted a little bit quicker to the system, and how Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks were ready to play high level basketball right out of the gate. So the one guy that was kind of lagging behind the rest, so to speak, for the first, half of the season was Jalen Green while he was adjusting. But he made those adjustments and he was able to grow and become a much better all-around player because of that. And that's actually what we want to tackle next here in just a moment, is talk about his individual growth, the areas in which he's able to impact the game now besides just his scoring, as well as the questions that we do still have about his game. Plus, we're going to get to our one game, one play, and one number metrics as we tackle Jalen Green's season in review and, of course, his season grade. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that huge win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now that we've kind of set the table for what it felt like kind of coming into the season, the expectations surrounding Jalen Green and how some of those may have been a little bit misplaced as we approached year three and navigated through year three, I do think we can look back now then at the season and think just at the immense amount of growth that Jalen did go throughout the season. I think it was kind of frustrating because even when Jalen was in the midst of his shooting woes and he was struggling, you could see that he was making strides in other areas of his game, right? He had improved his reads. He was growing as a facilitator. He was getting better and better as a defensive presence. Absolutely, right? Like
Ime Udoka acknowledged all of those things.
Yeah, he went from being a liability defensively to being a legitimate plus level defender from the start of the season to the end of the season when he's locked in and engaged, of course, because there were still some games there at the tail end of the season where I think after losing to the Golden State Warriors, I think it took the wind out of their sails a little bit. We saw some not so great performances from Jalen and Jabari kind of rounding out the end of the season. I think the young guys kind of struggled with that. The idea of not really playing for anything anymore once the play-in tournament was kind of out of the picture, I should say. But all of those areas, right? And then it came back down to the scoring, which was so problematic because scoring was supposed to be the one thing he was supposed to be able to do. So when that wasn't materializing, I think that's where a lot of, frustration started to mount with Jalen, where, they got to the point where questions started arising. Okay, well, do you make a change to the starting lineup? What do you ultimately do? But I think that we can look back now and see that and give credit to Ime Udoka, of course, for not losing sight of the forest for the trees, right? Where he stuck with Jalen, he was patient with him, and it really felt like he made a complete, evolution from the start of the year to where he is now as a basketball player, to where you can safely say, oh yeah, he is a much more well-rounded presence where he can impact the game with his rebounding, his defense, his facilitating, all of that. And to the point where he was commanding double teams at the end of the year once the scoring actually came back and he was playing at the level that we thought he was going to be playing at in year three.
And to Rafael Stone's credit, he had a media availability right before the All-Star break, which was one of Jalen's really down periods. Obviously, that was when the Rockets were considering taking him out of the starting lineup. And Rafael had this quote that he got a little bit of flack for on Twitter, but it was true that on paper, Jalen has a skill set that isn't replicated elsewhere on the roster. And that's true. And ultimately, I think that's why they stayed the course, because this was a team that for the season as a whole was below average on offense. I know since the All-Star break, they got to average or a little better once they increased the pace, the volume of threes, the tactical changes they made down the stretch of this year. But for the most part, this was a team that really grinded on the offensive end of the court, and there weren't many true bucket getters when things got sticky, especially once Alperen Sengun, I don't want to say there was a huge decline, but about midway through the year, he started struggling with a back injury. And then when he got hurt in early March and he wasn't out there at all, then that made it really difficult. And even when LP is out there, he's not really a perimeter guy who can create his own shot. He's a post player for the most part. So Jalen Green, the Rockets didn't have much of a choice other than to sink or swim with him based on what they needed with this roster. And fortunately, by the end of the year, he was swimming. And there's a lot of different things that you can point to with regards to growth he had as a shooter, finishing at the bucket. We can talk about, as Ime did plenty of times, making better reads, defending at a higher level. But I think there was one game, and I know we're going to get to, one game, one moment later on, but there was one down the stretch of the year that really illustrated that growth to me. And it was the Utah game at the end of March, when all the concerns we laid out earlier with regards to the mental side of the game, the mental makeup, sticking with it when things aren't going his way. That Utah game at the end of March, which capped the 11-game winning streak and kept the Rockets right on the Warriors' heels in the play-in race, Jalen had 4 points in the first half. They were playing at altitude. It wasn't night two of a road back-to-back, but it felt like it because they were in Oklahoma City that Wednesday night, had to go overtime, and exhausting victory. And then to play a couple of nights later against a slightly lesser team at altitude, it felt like they had nothing going. And he flipped it on a dime and got 30 in the second half, basically willing the Rockets across the finish line. That is exactly what, from a mental side, you want to see more of from Jalen Green, the ability to turn it around on the fly. And I think we saw that more and more down the home stretch of this season, the ability to, even if the game doesn't start well, to stick with it, to not let it take a toll on his body language, his overall effort, and just keep the process going and trust that eventually the shots are going to fall, or you're going to find a way to impact the game in other ways. If a team's constantly double teaming you and trapping you, as you were saying, then make the right reads and trust your teammates, trust Ime Udoka to have the right other guys out there that can take advantage of the 4-on-3s that you're generating. Just stick with the process and trust that over 48 minutes, it's going to work out. It felt like to start this year, for the reasons we laid out earlier, that wasn't happening. Down the home stretches this year, for the most part, not all the time, but for the most part, it felt like it was. And so for me, that's what really stood out the most, is that really, when you look at the back half of Jalen's year three, it felt like he got a lot mentally tougher. It felt like he was much sharper when it came to his decision-making. He trusted his teammates. He trusted himself a lot more. And so I would say just the growth in the mental side of the game, that's what really stood out.
Absolutely. Look, the confidence was kind of back, right? And that was the thing is, I think for the first half of the season, the confidence just wasn't. There were certain games where you could, maybe hit a couple early shots or whatever. And like you pointed out already, when things were going good, when the buckets were flowing, whatever, he played like himself. He played like the version of Jalen that we know that he's capable of playing, the upper echelon version of himself. But it's when that adversity hits, when he starts struggling, when maybe some of the shots aren't falling, when the defense is getting to him, when he's turning the ball over, whatever, when those issues start cropping up, how do you respond? And even throughout the Rockets, insane month of March, and as good as Jalen Green looked during that stretch, and really to kind of post All-Star break, there were still plenty of games where maybe Jalen didn't have the best first quarter or the best first half of a game, but then he would still respond in a big way. He would stick to it in the second half. At no point did he hang his head, or at no point did he, like you said, kind of fade into the background and let other guys kind of take over the game, or just defer to other guys. And part of that was by necessity, right? Because there was no more Alperen Sengun once he was down due to injury. So he didn't really have anybody else to lean on. It was just, hey, it's going to be, you're either going to live or die with what Jalen Green gives you, or to a lesser extent, what Fred VanVleet provides you, right? And there were some games where other guys, the role players would step up and rack up some points. But by and large, you had to depend on Jalen's insane production, especially once Alperen Sengun went down. And I do think that when we look at him, and when we look at how this year went, and especially that stretch in March, right? 13-2 record, the 11-game win streak, everything that he put together in that month. I wonder if at this point, the real big question here is, was it, more of the same of what we've seen in the past? Like, do you give Jalen the benefit of the doubt at this point that stretch was real? Or was that just another one of the hot streaks where we've seen it in the past, where he has an incredibly, explosive stretch of games where he looks unguardable, and then does it go back to more of the same? How does he carry that success from that month of March into next season? Like Ime Udoka said during his press conference, right, when asked about his parting words for Jalen Green, do it earlier, right? Like, don't wait until March to turn it on the way you did. Do it sooner. Be comfortable sooner. How does he carry that success over? And at this point, I do think he has earned the benefit of the doubt. I was at a point where, especially around the trade deadline, and many people were there, right? If the right trade was there for Jalen Green, maybe you make the trade, right? Because at that point, things had looked a little rough around the edges. Now, I think because of his growth as an all-around player in all the areas that we've already discussed, the defense, the rebounding, the facilitating, all that, plus the ceiling as a true tier 1 alpha level scorer, when we see that it's working, I think you have to give him the benefit of the doubt and at least run it back one more season and see what he and Alperen Sengun can accomplish together as a tandem duo when they're both playing at that level. Because that's the thing is, we didn't really see them both playing at that level together. There were maybe a handful of games I can point to. There were a couple games, there was one game against the Nuggets where Jalen Green looked absolutely incredible much earlier on in the season. There was the Lakers game at the end of January where Jalen Green and both Alperen and Sengun looked sensational playing with each other. They both had 30 plus that night, I believe. So there were, a handful of games where they were both playing their best version of basketball. And those are the games where you're like, oh my God, if this could be the Rockets star duo for the future, then absolutely you want to hold on to these guys for as long as possible. Yeah.
And I think we're at a point now where Jalen's coming back unless it is an obvious upgrade, i.e. a legitimate all-star level player now. Like, I don't even think Mikal Bridges qualifies anymore.
No.
We've had those hypotheticals in the past. Should the Rockets consider if such a deal was available to them? I don't think so, because the hardest thing to get in the NBA is a true alpha, a legitimate all-star or all-NBA type player.
A him.
Jalen.
A him.
Yeah,
Ben.
a him. Right. I think at this point, with the NBA being the most quality over quantity league of all, you can't give up a guy with Jalen's ceiling as young as he is unless you are getting someone that is already there. There's no reason for a team that is still developing to take a step back in terms of its ceiling, which is what I think you would be doing if you moved him for a Mikal Bridges type, someone in the good but not great tier. Because as much as we love the core six, nothing is guaranteed when it comes to these guys. I know they're on promising trajectories now, but it still remains to be seen if any of these guys can consistently get to an all-star level. So you have to think long and hard about someone that has shown the flashes that Jalen has, about giving them up for someone that doesn't have an all-star ceiling. So because of that, unless a huge deal comes across, and I don't know who that would be at this point, involving a player that is literally already there, I don't know why it would make more sense for the Rockets to reduce their ceiling as opposed to staying the course. And while it's not guaranteed, hoping that some of these things that we saw down the stretch of this season translate on a more consistent basis into next season.
Coming up, we've got our one game, one play, and one number for Jalen Green's season, as well as his overall season grade. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Look, sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that stuff out, especially to someone who's unbiased when it comes to your life. I've done therapy in the past, and I found it to be an incredibly cathartic experience to have an unbiased third party, a professional, kind of walk me through some of the things that I was dealing with in my life. Now, it could have been a professional disagreement or something that happened at work, or maybe you get into an argument with a close friend or a loved one, and having somebody really walk you through the emotions and problems that you're dealing with in your everyday life can be so beneficial. Therapy can be different for everyone, and honestly, most of us have bigger problems than what's going on with our favorite sports teams, and it's important to get those things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Today's episode is also brought to you by DoorDash. Look, Mother's Day is right around the corner, and moms are a gift, so give her the best this Mother's Day. Give gifts as thoughtful as she is with DoorDash. Select from hundreds of expertly crafted bouquets to the best of tech to self-care essentials and so much more delivered right to her doorstep. Get thoughtful gifts that she deserves with the convenience you need. Choose same-day delivery or schedule a week ahead for when flowers and gifts should arrive to her door with DoorDash. Get all your Mother's Day gifts all in one place. Get 50% off of your next order, up to $15 when you spend 15 plus on your next flower, convenience, grocery, or retail order now with code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA. Order using DoorDash today. Terms apply. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now we're about to get into our one game, one play, and one number section here for Jalen Green's season. But before we do that, we kind of already touched on this a little bit, Ben, right? Consistency has been kind of the name of the game for Jalen Green, and that's an area that he definitely needs to improve in as we move forward. Kind of, can he carry the consistency that he found in the month of March into this next season, right? And start it earlier, do it earlier, as Ime Udoka already referenced. But what else kind of comes to mind for you when you think of what Jalen Green needs to improve in moving forward?
So aside from the mental side, which I think accounts for some of his struggles this season's for the reasons we already outlined. I think in terms of the X's and O's of his game, one thing I would love to see him emphasize this offseason is the mid-range game, specifically 13 to 17 feet. I don't know if it's a matter of his shot and the touch. I don't know if it's his handle. I don't know if it's his footwork. It felt like he wasn't truly comfortable in those areas. We saw it at times, but for the most part, and this has been true of Jalen's 3 years with the Rockets, he's a, threes, layups, or free throws guy, in that he's either attacking the rim and trying to either finish around or over people or draw fouls, or he's looking for that step back three. And I think against bad teams, that translates pretty well. And against favorable matchups, it can. But I think there was a certain type of defender. When I looked at his splits by opponent, there were 3 teams that consistently gave him a lot of trouble. And I'm excluding Eastern Conference teams because generally you only play them twice. But the Timberwolves, the Grizzlies, and the Spurs, 3 guys that I think share a lot of traits in terms of defensive anchors for those teams: Rudy Gobert, Wemby, and Jaren Jackson Jr. Those athletic rim protectors that Jalen isn't able to just get around through his elite speed or athleticism. Guys who deter drives simply because they're out there. When you look up Jalen's splits against those opponents, they're really bad. And I think one thing that happens is that when he is reluctant to attack the cup, or he doesn't think he's going to be able to get to the line, then he ends up devolving into a step back 3-point guy. And we saw this a little bit for a different reason down the home stretch of the season when he struggled in that final 3-game road trip. I think it was for a very different reason. They didn't have the teams the Rockets were playing against, the whatever was left of the Jazz, the Blazers, and the Clippers. They certainly did not have a player like Gobert or Wemby. But I think because it's the end of a season, nobody's trying to get hurt. Jalen didn't want to attack the rim the way he normally does. He didn't want to risk injury. We saw Moses Brown fall on his leg as well. And so I think that played into it as well. And so when Jalen isn't going to the rim, or in those matchups doesn't feel that he can, then many times he devolves into just a step back 3-point guy. And that's inherently going to be very volatile. It may also sort of decrease his overall 3-point percentage because he takes a bit more. One thing that's interesting to me, he took fewer shots in year 3 than year 2 on a per game basis, but he actually took more threes in year 3 than year 2. So even though the overall shots went down, the threes went up. And so I think being able to score at all 3 levels, not just attack the rim, not just from 3-point range, but also have a respectable mid-range game, I think certainly it's important if he ever wants to get to that 30-plus points per game elite scorer level. But I also think in terms of the matchups against teams that have an elite rim protector, that's really important, because if you become one-dimensional and the defender knows that you're going for that step-back 3 every time because you don't trust your ability to get to the cup against a Gobert or Wemby type, then you become very predictable. And so I think for the next evolution of Jalen's game, to get from the low 20s, which he was in the back half of this season in scoring, to, an upper 20s to hopefully 30-plus points per game scorer, then developing that mid-range game, to me, that's the next thing that should be on his checklist. And again, I don't know how much is the shot. Maybe it's developing a floater the way James Harden did. Maybe it's continuing to refine the handle. I'm open to ideas, but I think the mid-range game is, if I was Jalen Green's trainer, that's what I would be emphasizing this offseason.
Yeah, and I mean, it looks nice when he's actually utilizing it, right? When he's snaking pick and rolls,
right,
getting to that safe little mid-range area. If that's what the defense is giving up, I do think we've seen him kind of go to it at times, very situationally, but not nearly enough the way that you would like him to maybe make it a staple part of his game to further unlock the rest of it. Because again, maybe it's easier to hit that mid-range shot than it is when the 3 ball is not falling. Hell, we see one of the leading, MVP vote getters this season with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, right? He heavily relies on that mid-range area, right? That free throw line, that kind of 15 to 18-foot range. He operates from out of there a lot, and it opens up the rest of his game. And he's not a guy that, is a high volume, 3-point guy, at least not right now. He can hit threes, but he doesn't make it a staple part of his game. He relies elsewhere on the floor. So I fully agree with you there. I'd love to see Jalen operate a little bit more out of the mid-range. So would our good friend over Ball Don't Stop. Ball Don't Stop would love to see Jalen Green get a little bit more active in the mid-range area. A lost art in today's NBA. All right. Let's get to our one game, one play, one number that we each have lined up for Jalen Green. I'm going to tee us off, Ben, with one game, and I think it's almost an obvious one. It's almost low-hanging fruit at this point, but Just mentioned Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He wasn't present for this game, but to me, I think it has to be game 10 of the Rockets winning streak in the month of March against the OKC Thunder. The overtime win, 132-126. Jalen Green was absolutely sensational in that game. He finished with 37 points, 10 rebounds, 7 assists, 2 steals, and a block on 14 of 24 shooting. And this was a game where even though the Thunder didn't have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, they're still a very, very good Thunder team, incredibly well coached by Mark Daigneault. And it felt like every single time the Thunder started to pull ahead, started to make a little bit of, a buffer, some room, whatever, Jalen Green had an answer. He had a response, whether it was a three, whether it was a clutch layup, whether it was driving to the rim, getting free throws, whatever it was, Jalen Green had an answer every single time the Thunder created a little bit of separation. And to take over that game, that game was what a star level takeover looked like for Jalen to drag. I know you talked about the Utah Jazz game, the 30 points in the second half. I fully agree with that, but this one felt like that, but against a upper echelon opponent and a very, very good Thunder team. So I think that to me has to be my game of the year for Jalen Green, period.
Yeah, that would be mine as well, but it would be boring if we picked the exact same game. So I'll actually go with January 29th against the Lakers, a game that Jalen had 34 and 12, because I think Jalen and Sengun, they both had 30 plus points, 10 plus rebounds. One of the youngest duos.
That was the three-headed monster game where Jalen made me look like a jackass.
Oh, yeah. So. But yeah, one of the youngest duos in NBA history to go for 30 and 10 in the same game. Yeah. And I think that's noteworthy because we know the narrative now. Can he do it with Sengun? Well, there's an example of Jalen doing it at a very high level with Sengun against a team that is still in the playoffs and had both LeBron James and Anthony Davis playing that night. So just at, a narrative level, the fact that Jalen can do that with Alperen and Sengun, I think that's noteworthy, even if for the reasons you laid out, the OKC game is going to be more memorable in the grand scheme.
I love that. That Lakers game was something else. That was really special to see both of those guys go off the way that they did that night. All right, I've got my one play, and it was really tough to pick one specific play out of a season of really incredible plays from Jalen Green, especially that back half when he really started to turn things on. But the one play that I picked is actually from game 1 of the Rockets' 11-game win streak against the Portland Trailblazers, and it's going to be the poster dunk that Jalen had on Anthony Simons. But it's not... First off, the poster itself was absolutely insane. One of the best, easily one of the contenders for dunk of the year here. But it wasn't just the dunk that mattered. It was kind of the lead up to the dunk and also what happened after the dunk. And that's why it's my play of the year for Jalen. The build up to that is the Rockets struggled that game, right? They were down like 10, early third quarter against the Blazers. This is a bad Blazers team, right? They looked like they were, having an off night. They looked like they were very much headed for a loss in that game. Very lifeless, whatever. Jalen got the dunk because he played the passing lane and got a steal. So he played defense to get in transition to be able to have the dunk in the first place. So love that he was playing the passing lanes, love that he got in transition and then elevated and completely postered Anthony Simons. And it was that poster that ignited the run that the Rockets went on in the second half, where Jalen and a little bit later on, Amen Thompson really took over that game and carried the Rockets to a win. Ultimately, I want to say the final score of that game, I had it here a second ago. It was Rockets Blazers. They won by 16, 123-107. So to see Jalen kind of have or really by extension, the whole team have a so-so first half, and then to just have that moment where your star player, where one of your best players makes a play like that, hustle on defense, gets the turnover, goes out in transition, and completely just detonates on the opposing player. I think that really invigorated the whole team. And so that's my play of the year for Jalen Green, or my one play, I should say.
Yeah, my one play for Jalen, although it really could be any of 3, but that Oklahoma City game you referenced, it was the play at the end of regulation that should have been the game winner if only the Rockets had fouled up 3. God, what an annoying trend that was. But the pass to Jabari Smith Jr. in a game that Jalen had so much working for himself to, in that moment, not feel that he had to force the issue, to realize that he was going to draw that much attention, to play with pace, which is an emphasis for Ime Udoka since the All-Star break, and to trust Jabari Smith Jr., who was not shooting well that game, to say, look, even though I'm hot, Jabari isn't. If this is the best look for us in a high leverage possession, then let's do it. I'm going to trust the process, to go back to what we said earlier. And ultimately the process paid off. Jabari hit a clutch shot. And then in overtime of that game, it was telling, when it was a close game in the final 70 seconds or so of overtime. So he had the incredible step back three that I think put the Rockets up 6. Then Isaiah Joe matched it, and all of a sudden it was a one possession game again. And so after he had the 3 the first time, and so they were even more aware of the step back, for Jalen to then have the wherewithal to realize that on the fly and say, hey, this is what they think I'm going to do. And so the next time, what did he do? He attacked the cup and finished through contact. And so to see him make those changes on the fly, it's not just about reads in terms of a given play. It's also about game feel. And for him to be able throughout the closing minutes of regulation and overtime in that game to make the right decisions and mix it up so that it didn't get predictable, it's just the sort of little thing, the intangible that the truly great players have. And while he needs to show it much more consistently, for him to do it down the stretch of that game, those were all moment of the year for me. But if I had to choose, I'll go with the Jabari 3, simply because I think Jalen trusting the process and trusting someone that wasn't himself, to me, that's really, really hard to do for a young scorer in the NBA just in his 3rd season.
And it speaks volumes just about his growth, right? His mentality towards the game and making those right reads, right? That Ime Udoka has spoken so highly about. All right, one number. Now, I was digging through a variety of different numbers, and I settled on this one because I think it's really important here. Is there were various points where Ime Udoka has called out this Rockets team about rebounding, about their physicality, how they match the physicality of opposing teams. Before the Rockets game, let me grab the numbers here. It was back mid. I had the game pulled up here. Yeah, late January. If you were to crunch the numbers from January 24th and before, so all from opening season tip-off all the way up to January 24th. That was before Jalen Green ever had his first double-double. He had his first double-double of his career earlier this past season against the Charlotte Hornets, the 10-rebound game. It was the first time he had a career double-double. Before that stretch, he averaged 4.5 rebounds a game. Nothing crazy, nothing fancy. After that point on, once he had a stretch where he had 10 rebounds, then another 10 rebound game, then a 12 rebound game, the one against the Lakers that we already highlighted where he and Alperen both put on a show. From that point on, after his first career double-double with the rebounds, he went on to average 5.9 rebounds per game to close out the season. So basically 6 rebounds per contest. The rebounding was so important for Jalen for a variety of reasons. One, I think it gives him another dimension to impact the game, whether it's securing an offensive rebound, right? Closing out defensive possessions strong. But I also think it helped ignite his offense by getting those defensive rebounds, getting out and running in transition. And then later on in the season, as Ime Udoka started to trust and insert Amin Thompson and Cam Whitmore a little bit more into the rotation, and we had some of those, 2-man lineups with Jalen and one of the other two, or Jalen and both of the other two in that 3-man lineup where it was Jalen, Amin, and Cam, and they trusted their youth and their athleticism and their speed to get them some easy opportunities in transition. I think that rebounding really helped Jalen a lot. And I think he made it a point to himself to be aggressive and to attack the glass, to be able to then get out and have some of those easy offensive opportunities, ways for him to play in transition, which was something that he spoke about after that Timberwolves loss.
Yeah. And so there's going to be some overlap between that and my number. My number is 40 in reference to the final 40 games, which when did that stretch begin? January 24th. You just said it. And the rebounding is part of it, but it's broader than that. Obviously, the story is Jalen's growth as a player. In the last 40 games, which is basically half of a season, he averaged more than 22 points per game, almost 6 rebounds, 4 assists, shot over 44% from the field, almost 45, above 34% on threes, true shooting percentage 56. That's half of a season. To put it in context, those are almost identical numbers across the board to Anthony Edwards in year 2. Translated, the second half of Jalen Green's age 21 season, almost identical from a statistical perspective to Anthony Edwards in year 2. And in terms of team impact, that's something that's sort of been in the background of Jalen his whole career, even when he's had good games statistically. The net ratings and whatnot have not always reflected that. The plus minus for Jalen in the final 40 games was plus 2.1. For Anthony Edwards, it was plus 2.6. So very close across the board. We're talking about 1 year. Now, I know that's only half a year, but I'm giving Jalen the benefit of the doubt to take this full circle to what we were saying leading off the pod, the headwinds that he had going into this season, the stark contrast between not just his first 2 Rockets seasons, but the G League Ignite as well. For the back half of this year, and I think that's important because it's a big enough sample that you have plenty of peaks and valleys. You had the so-called untradeable tour at the end of January, right before the trade deadline. You had the bad stretch leading into the All-Star break when he almost got benched. You had the incredible month of March when he nearly won West Player of the Month. And you had a somewhat lethargic April, although I think some of that was just, as I mentioned, him not wanting to throw his body into harm's way at the end of the season.
I think you can just kind of hand wave that one. So
Yeah. So there's lots of good and bad. 40 games is a sufficient sample. We're talking half of a season in which his overall output was very similar to year 2 Anthony Edwards. Now, am I saying for sure that Jalen Green is back on the Anthony Edwards plan? No, I'm not saying that. There is volatility. There are risks, as we've outlined throughout this show. There are things he needs to improve at. But because that upside is still there, again, we're talking about basically a 1-year difference. I don't know how it would not make, if you're in the Rockets front office, if you're Rafael Stone, I don't know how it wouldn't make you very cautious this offseason when it comes to potentially offloading him. Not saying it would never happen. I mean, if a legitimate all-NBA type guy hypothetically comes available, I don't know that you can entirely dismiss it because there are at least some risk. And if you're acquiring someone who already is, then there is value in the certainty. But unless it's something of that magnitude, even if we're talking a very good player, but one with a ceiling like Mikal Bridges, I don't know how in the world you can look at the last 40 games, compare it to other young guys around the league, and not see a case for substantial optimism moving forward. Maybe it's not exactly to the same degree as before this year, but when you look at the context and all the other factors, I'm pretty bullish about Jalen and Houston heading into year 4.
I like it. I like the confidence, and I'm right there with you. I wouldn't move him unless it was for a bona fide star level player at this point, because again, he's earned the benefit of the doubt with his play over the back half of this most recent season. All right, that brings us to, we're going to drop our season grades here. We talked about Jalen for the entirety of this episode, so we'll just wrap up with a quick little season grade for Ben and for myself. Ben, I'll give you the honors. You go first. What grade are you giving Jalen for this season?
Yeah, I'll go B. We can't ignore the first half of the season, but if we were grading him just based on the second half, and you look at those numbers in context of, again, there's a guy in Anthony Edwards that we've compared him to throughout his career for good reason. For the second half of the season, I don't know how you can look at that and not give him an A or A- at the worst. So the first half of the season, even if it was underwhelming, and it was, he did enough in terms of his reads, his processing, his defense, the growth that Ime talked about. I'm not going to give him lower than a C. And then the second half is clearly an A. So I'll average those out and say B for Jalen Green. I'm glad you mentioned the mapping out, and kind of, if you were to separate Jalen Green's 2 seasons into 2 separate players, then yeah, I'd feel very comfortable in grading the first half of the season as a C, maybe a C-. But you're right, he did make strides and grew in the areas that Ime was asking him to grow in. But then you factor that into the B player, whatever, the second half of his season, and you can very comfortably say that was, an A level or A- level production. So I'm right there with you. Give him a solid B for this year, and hopefully that B carries into next season a little bit earlier this time around next year. But Ben, you know the drill. Let me know where to track you down at. Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Rockets Wire on Twitter /X, the Logger Line, and of course, rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts, or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Drop your thoughts about Jalen Green's season. How would you grade Jalen Green's season? And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, a 5-star review helps us out tremendously. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.